February 14th, 1933. Harlem. 4:32 in the morning. 12 men stepped out of the shadows. 12 guns leveled at one body. Bumpy Johnson stood alone in a basement with one staircase, no windows, no witnesses. Everyone in New York already knew how this story was supposed to end. Dutch Schultz had sent his best killers. Men who didn't miss. Men who didn't leave survivors. By sunrise, only one of those 12 would walk back into the Bronx alive. Not as a victor. Not as a hero. But as a messenger carrying a warning so cold, it made a man who'd killed 40 people stop smiling. That night didn't end a life. It created a legend. Have you ever heard of a man whose name alone could shut down an entire street? Because long before sunrise in Harlem, that name was Dutch Schultz. Schultz wasn't just a gangster. He was an empire. Bootlegging during Prohibition had made him unimaginably rich, but it was violence that kept him in power. They said more than 40 men had died at his command, shot, stabbed, erased without records or funerals. Some vanished so completely, their families never even learned where to mourn. Dutch didn't need to raise his voice. His reputation did that for him. He controlled police with payoffs, judges with pressure, and neighborhoods with fear. When Dutch Schultz marked a man, the outcome was never in doubt. There was no escaping him, no hiding in basements or back rooms. His crews were professionals, executioners who moved fast, struck clean, and left nothing unfinished. So when word spread that Dutch had personally ordered 12 of his deadliest men into Harlem, people didn't argue about if someone would die. They argued about how long it would take. Minutes, maybe seconds. Against that kind of power, that kind of reputation, survival wasn't even part of the conversation. And standing alone in that basement, Bumpy Johnson looked like just another name about to be crossed off Dutch Schultz's list. But here's the part no one understood at the time. Bumpy Johnson did not play by anyone's rules. In a world where power came from numbers, from guns, from how many men you could throw at a problem, Bumpy operated on something far more dangerous: calculation. He didn't posture. He didn't threaten. He didn't rush. When Bumpy spoke, it wasn't to scare people. It was to tell them what was already decided. He didn't believe survival belonged to the strongest man in the room. He believed it belonged to the one who understood the room. The angles. The timing. The people watching from the shadows. While others chased fear, Bumpy chased leverage. While others reacted, he prepared. That's why standing there, outnumbered 12-1, didn't register as a death sentence to him. It registered as a situation, one that could be turned, bent, reshaped. Bumpy Johnson wasn't interested in proving he was dangerous. He was interested in proving something far more unsettling, that the rules everyone else lived by simply didn't apply to him. To understand why that basement mattered, you have to understand Harlem in 1933. This wasn't the glamorous Harlem of jazz posters and newspaper headlines anymore. The Great Depression had hollowed the neighborhood out. Factories were closing. Jobs vanished overnight. Men lined up for soup with their pride already spent. $1 could mean the difference between eating and not eating. In that world, hope became a business. And that business was the numbers racket. For a nickel, a man could dream. For a dime, a woman could imagine a week without hunger. People who made $7 a week were betting on miracles, and sometimes just often enough they won. That illegal lottery wasn't just gambling. It was psychological oxygen. It gave people something to believe in when the banks had failed them and the government had forgotten them. Money flowed through Harlem every single day because of it. Small bills, crumpled coins, endless volume. And where money flows, predators follow. To outsiders, Harlem looked desperate. To men like Dutch Schultz, it looked undefended. A river of cash protected only by black operators, ignored by the law except when bribes were needed. But to the people who lived there, Harlem wasn't just territory. It was community. It was survival. It was dignity in a city that offered them very little of it. Control of the numbers meant control of hope itself. That's why Harlem was worth killing for. And that's why it was worth dying for. Bumpy Johnson didn't fit the picture people had of an enforcer. He wasn't loud. He wasn't reckless. And he wasn't driven by impulse. The men who underestimated him made the same mistake. They thought muscle was all he brought to the table. It wasn't. Bumpy had learned early that fists and guns were tools, not answers. Time in prison didn't harden him the way it hardened others. It sharpened him. He read Shakespeare, philosophy, history. He studied people the way other men studied weapons. He understood ego, fear, loyalty, how each one could be pulled like a lever if you knew where to apply pressure. In Harlem, that made him invaluable. When Madame Stephanie St. Clair's runners were robbed, Bumpy didn't just retaliate blindly. He tracked the money, found who benefited, and took it back quietly. When corrupt cops leaned too hard on black businesses, Bumpy didn't always break bones. Sometimes careers collapsed instead. Reputations disappeared. Promotions stopped coming. The message landed without a single shot fired. That's why the neighborhood trusted him. He didn't exploit Harlem's desperation, he insulated it. He made sure numbers winners got paid. He made sure outsiders understood the line they weren't allowed to cross. Violence was always an option, but never the first one. And when it came, it was precise. So standing alone in that basement, the question wasn't whether Bumpy would survive. It was whether everyone else had misunderstood him all along. This wasn't a man hoping to get lucky. This was a man who had already run the scenario in his head. At some point, fear shifted. You stopped worrying about Bumpy Johnson. And you started trusting him. The breaking point came quietly, the way real wars usually do. Dutch Schultz didn't send gunmen at first. He sent emissaries. They arrived in Harlem dressed in confidence, white suits in a black neighborhood, sitting down like they already owned the place. They met Madame Stephanie St. Clair in her club on 133rd Street. No shouting, no threats at first. Just numbers, percentages, and the assumption that resistance was temporary. The message was simple: work with Dutch, pay tribute, or disappear. Everyone in that room understood what it meant. Dutch wasn't asking for partnership. He was announcing a takeover. Harlem's money would flow north, and whoever stood in the way would be buried quietly. Madame St. Clair listened without interrupting. A woman who had built her empire from nothing, who had survived men far worse than these, looked at them calmly and said two words that no one ever said to Dutch Schultz. Get out. The emissaries turned to Bumpy Johnson, standing in the corner, silent, still. They tried again, softer this time. Smarter. They warned him that survival required compromise. That pride was expensive. That Dutch Schultz did not hear the word no. Bumpy didn't answer. He didn't threaten. He didn't negotiate. He just stared. It was the kind of silence that made men reconsider their life insurance. The kind that said everything without saying anything at all. The emissaries left and carried that silence back to the Bronx. Dutch Schultz understood it perfectly. It wasn't defiance, it was refusal. And in Dutch's world, refusal meant war. From that moment on, there was no middle ground left. No deals to make. No lines to step back behind. The next move would be violent. The date Dutch chose wasn't accidental. Valentine's Day. A night meant for romance, for lowered guards, for people thinking about anything except survival. Dutch liked irony. He liked the poetry of making an example when no one was expecting it. Word reached Harlem just before dawn. Dutch's men were planning to hit Madame St. Clair's main counting house on Lenox Avenue. Fast, loud, public. The kind of strike designed to break morale and send a message to every numbers runner in the neighborhood. If the counting house fell, Harlem would follow. Bumpy heard the warning and didn't call a meeting. He didn't gather soldiers. He didn't send word ahead. He put on his coat and went alone. That's the detail everyone fixated on afterward. Alone. From the outside, it looked like a fatal mistake. 12 of Dutch Schultz's most dangerous men had already been spotted in the area. Killers with reputations. Professionals who didn't improvise and didn't miss. And Bumpy Johnson, the man Dutch wanted dead more than anyone, walked straight toward the danger without backup. The Cotton Club basement was still open. Not the famous downtown club for white audiences, but the real one, Harlem's after-hours room. Crates of liquor, poker tables. One narrow staircase in and out. A place where business was settled quietly. Bumpy knew that basement. He'd been there countless times. He also knew what it represented: privacy, isolation, control. To anyone watching from a distance, descending those stairs at 4:30 in the morning looked like stepping into a coffin. Maybe it was arrogance. Maybe it was desperation. Or, maybe Bumpy Johnson understood something. The men waiting for him did not. Because as he walked down those steps, The trap was already closing. And from every angle, it appeared he had just made the last decision of his life. The basement was dark, quiet except for the soft hum of a single light bulb swinging from the ceiling. Wooden crates lined the walls. Cards and chips sat abandoned on a table like the game had never finished. Bumpy Johnson reached the bottom step and stopped. That's when the shadows moved. One by one, men stepped forward, 12 of them. 12 guns came up in near-perfect unison, barrels steady, fingers already resting on triggers. There was no panic in their faces. These weren't street punks. These were professionals. Men who had done this before and expected to walk away again. Tommy, the one they called the executioner, took a step closer. He smiled the way men smile when they believe the outcome is settled. He told Bumpy that Dutch Schultz sent his regards. That there would be no deals tonight. No speeches. Just a body on a basement floor. Bumpy didn't move. His hands stayed at his sides. His breathing didn't change. He looked around the room slowly, deliberately, counting faces, counting weapons, mapping the space. 12. When his eyes returned to Tommy, his voice was calm, almost curious. That's all he sent. The smile disappeared. For a moment, no one spoke. Even men who make their living killing understand when something isn't reacting the way it's supposed to. Tommy raised his gun a little higher and told him he had 5 seconds to beg. Bumpy tilted his head slightly, as if considering the offer. He told them they were making a mistake. Laughter rippled through the room, short and sharp. A man with 12 guns pointed at him didn't get to talk about mistakes. Tommy said he was about to die. Bumpy said nothing else. And in that silence, thick, heavy, unbearable, something shifted. Not fear, hesitation. A fraction of doubt that had no business being there, but was. 12 men held their aim. One man held the room, and nobody pulled the trigger. Nobody ever said, Bumpy Johnson reached for a gun. Because he didn't. The moment stretched just long enough for the men in the room to realize something was wrong. Then Bumpy moved not toward a weapon, not toward an exit, but straight up. One step, one strike. His fist connected with the swinging bulb and glass exploded overhead. Darkness swallowed the basement instantly. What followed wasn't a shootout. It was confusion. Shouts. Boots scraping against concrete. The sudden, terrifying awareness that 12 guns meant nothing if you couldn't see what you were aiming at. The first shots came wild, panicked, echoing off the walls. Someone screamed for everyone to hold their fire, but fear doesn't listen to orders. In that darkness, the advantage flipped. Bumpy knew the room. He had played cards there. He knew where the tables were, where the crates blocked movement, where the staircase narrowed. The men Dutch sent didn't. They turned in circles, firing at shadows, colliding with each other, shouting names that vanished into the chaos. Bumpy didn't rush. He moved with rhythm. Step. Strike. Shift. He let their panic build, let their gunfire betray their positions. Violence stopped being about firepower and became about control, about timing, space, and breath. In less than a minute, the rules had changed. The guns were still there. But they no longer mattered. In the dark, the loudest thing in the room wasn't gunfire anymore. It was the sound of men realizing they had lost control. The basement became a storm with no center. Gunshots cracked through the darkness, sharp and blind, ricocheting off walls, tearing into crates, finding flesh by accident more than aim. Men shouted orders that went unheard. Someone screamed a name. Someone else screamed in pain. Fear piled on top of fear until no one knew who was shooting at whom anymore. Bodies went down, not always from bullets. A thud. A choke of breath. The sound of bone hitting concrete. In the dark, every movement was a threat, every sound a target. Fingers tightened on triggers. Guns bucked. Muzzles flashed for half a second, just long enough to betray a position before another shot answered it. Bumpy Johnson never fired once. He let the chaos do the work. He let panic turn professionals into amateurs. Men tripped over tables they couldn't see, slammed into walls they didn't remember, shot at shadows that sounded like footsteps. Friendly fire became inevitable. Violence fed on itself. Someone tried to reach the stairs. Too late. Someone tried to crawl. Didn't get far. The noise rose, peaked, then began to collapse inward as men ran out of breath, ammunition, and courage. What felt like hours was over in minutes. Then, suddenly, there was silence. When the basement door finally opened and light spilled down the stairs, the scene didn't make sense. 11 men were down, some unconscious, some bleeding, some broken in ways that couldn't be fixed quickly. Guns lay scattered across the floor, useless now. And only one was still upright, pressed against the wall, shaking so hard he could barely breathe. Bumpy Johnson was gone. 12 men had walked into that basement expecting an execution. The outcome defied reason. But every step that led there followed a brutal, perfect logic. The man who survived wasn't spared by chance. He was spared on purpose. Marty Delaney crawled up the basement stairs as dawn crept into Harlem, every breath cutting into broken ribs. Blood soaked through his coat. His hands shook so badly he could barely flag down a cab. He didn't ask questions. He didn't explain. He gave one address and prayed. He stayed conscious long enough to reach it. Arthur Avenue. Dutch Schultz's headquarters. When Marty stumbled into the room, the conversation stopped. Dutch Schultz was eating breakfast eggs, toast, coffee, reading the paper like it was any other morning. He looked up once, took in the blood, the terror, the empty space where 11 men should have been. Where are the others? Marty shook his head. They're all down. Dutch stood slowly. He asked the only question that mattered. Why are you alive? Marty reached into his jacket. Dutch's men tensed, hands drifting toward their guns. But Marty didn't pull a weapon. He pulled out a single playing card. The ace of spades, smeared dark with blood. He placed it on the table. He said to tell you, Marty whispered, Harlem's not for sale. And if you send more men, send more cards. He's collecting a deck. No threats. No explanations. No second message. Just a symbol. A warning. A promise. Dutch Schultz stared at that card for a long time. And in that silence, everyone in the room understood something had changed. Because the deadliest message isn't the one shouted loudest. It's the one that never needs to be repeated. Dutch Schultz did something that morning no one expected him to do. He backed down. The men in the room waited for rage, for orders, for a declaration of war. They expected Dutch to send 50 men into Harlem, to burn counting houses, to make an example so loud no one would ever challenge him again. That was the Dutch Schultz they knew. Instead, he studied the ace of spades, turned it between his fingers, and smiled not with amusement, but with understanding. He knew what it cost to fight a man who wasn't afraid to die, a man who planned instead of reacted, a man who had an entire neighborhood behind him. War with someone like that didn't end with a winner. It ended with ruin. Dutch dropped the card into an ashtray and lit it. The edges curled as it burned. We're done in Harlem, he said. Let him have it. And just like that, the most feared gangster in New York walked away from one of the richest territories in the city. From that night forward, Bumpy Johnson's name carried weight. Not because he killed indiscriminately, but because he didn't have to. Harlem knew who protected it. Outsiders learned where the line was drawn. For more than 3 decades, Bumpy ruled not through terror, but through strategy, loyalty, and a code that valued respect over chaos. The story of that basement spread quietly, then permanently. Some said it was legend. Some said it was exaggeration. But no one ever tested it again. Because one truth survived every version of the story: respect isn't given. It's taken, and that's where the story leaves us. Not with gunfire, not with bodies, but with a question that still hangs in the air. What would you have done if you were Dutch Schultz? Would you have doubled down, sent more men, chased revenge no matter the cost? Or would you have recognized the moment when power stops being about fear and starts being about survival? Because the truth is, not every battle is won by pulling the trigger. Some are won by knowing when the war is already over. Bumpy Johnson didn't just defend Harlem that night. He rewrote the rules of power. He showed that intelligence can outweigh numbers, that restraint can be more terrifying than violence, and that real authority doesn't need to announce itself. If this story made you think, hit subscribe. If you respect strategy over chaos, leave a like. And in the comments, tell us, was Bumpy Johnson a hero, a criminal, or something far more complicated? More untold stories. More moments that shaped legends. Don't miss what's coming next.